Hi, Dr. Bob here to talk to you today about image file formats. This is a talk that I gave at Fairview Hospital in November 2011 with a few minor updates since then. It's a very technical talk, but one that's necessary to understand the different image file formats that are used in storing and managing photographs. So let's get on with it. You may be asking yourself some questions. For example, my camera takes photos in JPEG format. Is that how I should store them on my computer? Or someone told me that I should shoot my photos in RAW format or in TIFF format. Is that true? Or my editing program asked me if I want lossy compression or lossless compression. What is compression? What kind of image format should I use to post my photos on Facebook or email to my friends? And finally, I want to print an 11 by 14 enlargement of my favorite photograph. Do I have enough resolution on my original image? If you have asked these kind of questions, then this talk is for you. Let's go through and cover all of these subjects in one way, shape, or form. The talk here is divided really into 5 parts. The first part is bits and bytes. A bit of a geeky subject, like the Geek Squad at Best Buy. In fact, I've been so geeky, my wife has been calling me Wayne Szalinski, who was the Rick Moranis character in Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, who was kind of your absent-minded professor, scientist, computer geek. So I apologize for the geekiness of this talk, but again, it's necessary to know the basics. Second portion of the talk will be pixels and megapixels, and how that pertains to image quality. Third, we will talk about color depth. Fourth, we'll talk about the actual file types and then compression. You'll notice that even on this screen, the Geek Squad image is a GIF file and the Wayne Szalinski is a JPEG, and we'll get into those different file types. And then finally, what some of my recommendations are for your actual workflow, how you manage images, how you upload them to the web, how you send them to other people, how you get them printed. Okay? Let me start with this, and the bits and bytes section of the talk. I've been in my home for about 20 years, and I was given this garage door opener when I moved in. Now, it so happens that our neighborhood was all built by the same builder, so we all have the same brand of garage door opener. My question is, why does this garage door opener work on my garage door, but not on the next door neighbor's? And it's not a difference in frequency. All of these are on the same frequency. Well, the answer lies on the inside of this. If you take the top off and look, what you'll see are a series of switches. In this particular model, there are 9 switches, and you'll see that the first 6 are down there. Switches 7 and 9 are up. And so that gives a specific code sent out by this garage door opener and a matching code inside my garage. When the codes match, then the garage door is activated. So the first part of this talk is about bits, which are equivalent to these switches. In fact, if you add a single switch, you basically have 2 possible options. It can be off or it can be on, just like a light switch. If you have 2 switches, then we have 4 possible combinations. Think of this as the light switch in your bedroom and the light switch in your bathroom. They can both be off, they can both be on, or the bedroom can be on with the bathroom off, or the bedroom off and the bathroom on. So you have 4 possible combinations when you've got 2 switches. If you add a third switch, that takes us up to 8 possible combinations. Add a 4th switch, now we're up to 16 possible combinations. Every time you add a switch, you go up by a factor of 2 if the switch has 2 positions. So in terms of a formula for this, well, the possible combinations equals 2 to the nth power, where n is the number of switches. And I apologize if you don't remember your exponents from high school math, but this is pretty straightforward. Just go up by the powers of 2. Now I want to look more specifically at these 4 switches. I flipped them upside down so that the 1 is on the right end, which is kind of the way we're used to dealing with numbers. And I want to show you all 16 possible combinations when you've got 4 switches to deal with. In the first one up on the top left, you'll notice that all 4 switches are flipped over to the off, which is now at the top there. And so we might denote this as 0, 0, 0, 0. The second tracing, though, shows that switch number 1 is now flipped on. So that would be denoted as 0, 0, 0, 1. In the third one, switch number 2 is now activated, so we would call that 0, 0, 1, 0, with each one of these zeros or ones correlating to one switch. The fourth one, 0, 0, 1, 1. Fifth one, 0, 1, 0, 0. Sixth one, 0, 1, 0, 1. Seventh, 0, 1, 1, 0. And eighth possible combination, 0, 1, 1, 1. Now obviously this is difficult to work in if all you've got are zeros and ones, although on a computer basis, everything comes down to bits. Everything comes down to switches that are on or off. It's a binary alphabet. Now we don't like that, so we might simplify this and call these 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 in our decimal numeric system. We've got 8 additional combinations where switch number 4 is on, and then run right down the line here from 1, 0, 0, 0 all the way up to 1, 1, 1, 1, where all 4 switches are on. And again, in the decimal system, we might count these as numbers 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. Now it turns out you can do yet another counting system called hexadecimal, where we would go 0 through 7 here for the 8 switch combinations on the left. And on the right, after we get to 8 and 9, instead of going to 10, let's just call it A. 10 equals A, 11 equals B, 12 equals C, 13 equals D, 14 equals E, and 15 equals F. What that would then allow us to do with a single digit, be it a letter or a number, we could denote all 16 possible combinations, going 0 through F. That's called a hexadecimal system. And in fact, if you remember back to high school math, the first system, binary, is what we call base 2. Decimal is base 10. And hexadecimal is base 16. Now let's get into some definitions here. What is a bit? Well, a bit is basically one switch. It's a binary digit with 2 possible combinations. It's either on or it's off. What is a nibble? A term not used too much, but it refers to 4 bits. So what we were just looking at was the possible combinations for a nibble, 4 bits, 16 possible combinations. A byte would be if you take 2 nibbles and put them together. You go from 4 switches, or 4 bits, to 8 switches, or 8 bits. And that gives you 2 to the 8th power, or 256 possible combinations. What would they look like? Well, in the decimal system, you'd start at 0 in the top left and just count all the way up and finish at 255. So those are your possible combinations. And this is the numbering system we use a lot when we denote colors on a computer screen, and we'll get into that a little bit later. If you're a computer techie, you might be more familiar with this system. This is the hexadecimal system, where we call one nibble 0 through F and the other nibble 0 through F. Put them together, and what you get is a 2-digit combination going from 0, 0 at the bottom all the way up to FF at the top. In this way, any individual byte can be designated by a 2-digit code. And perhaps you've seen your computer crash sometime, and you'll see these codes, an error at such and such a location, and they'll give you a big long series of digits that look like this in groups of 2. That has to do with locations in the computer memory and so forth. But in hexadecimal computer lingo, you'll see these designations all the time. All right, back to our definitions. What is a kilobyte? Well, that is 2 to the 10th power of bytes. And it turns out 2 to the 10th is very close to 10 to the 3rd, or 1,000. So those are kind of used interchangeably, although it's not quite exactly true. 2 to the 10th power would take you from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32 to 64 to 128 to 256 to 512, and finally to 1,024 bytes. For ballpark purposes, we'll say that's about 1,000 bytes. So a kilobyte, roughly speaking, is 1,000 bytes. If you go 2 to the 20th bytes, you've gone up another factor of 1,000. We're up to about 1,000,000 bytes. That's called a megabyte. Do it again, another 1,000th factor. We're up to 1,000,000,000 bytes, or what's effectively a gigabyte. And now, introduced to our lingo within the last few years, is something called a terabyte. This is another factor of 2 to the 10th power, and we're up to 1,000,000,000,000 bytes. This is a big number. 1 terabyte is technically this many bytes: 1,099,511,627,776 bytes. That is a lot of data, and it's kind of astounding to think that our national debt in dollars is close to 15 times that figure. What's on the horizon? The next factor of 10 is called a petabyte. I haven't seen that used yet, but that would be 1 quadrillion bytes. Beyond that, exabyte and some other designations that may come to our vocabulary in the next few years. Well, what do these numbers all mean? Well, a byte can be thought of as basically 1 character in a document or a text message. So you text somebody, you may have a maximum number of characters, say 180 or something like that. That would be a factor of 500 bytes or less. You email someone or send a document, a small Microsoft Word document or an Excel document. It might be 1 kilobyte to 500 kilobytes, but that's not very big actually, if you're dealing mainly with text. A digital photograph, on the other hand, has a lot of information. We're talking 100 kilobytes up to maybe as high as 50 megabytes or beyond now with the newer cameras. This is a lot of data. An audio CD has 700 megabytes on it, typically. 80 minutes of information. And each song would be roughly 40 megabytes. Those of you that have iPods know that you can compress a song down from that 40 megabytes by a factor of about 10 without any noticeable loss in quality. And around 4 megabytes would be your MP3 song, as you would save it on an iPod or other MP3 player. A DVD has 4.7 gigabytes of potential information on it. A Blu-ray disc, take that up by another factor of 4, up to 17 gigabytes. Your typical iPod, you get a little teeny nano, might be 2 or 4 gigabytes. You get a full-blown one, you might be up to 160 gigabytes. A computer RAM, what you have in your computer to manage your processes at any given time. Typically in 2011, this will range from 2 gigabytes to 8 gigabytes. And finally, your computer hard drives. It used to be just in megabytes. Now we're up to gigabytes and even up to terabytes. Let me show you the 2 hard drives in my computer. First one is said to be a 500 gigabyte, and you'll see the number here circled. It is indeed over 500 billion bytes. Because of that subtle difference between 1,000 and 1,024, you get some discrepancies here. So 465 gigabytes is the technical capacity of this particular hard drive. Then I've got another hard drive in my computer that's stated to be a 2 terabyte, and it has 2 trillion bytes in it, or 1.81 terabytes. A lot of data storage capacity there. All right. Let's move on from bits and bytes to pixels and megapixels. What is a pixel? Well, a pixel, that's a shortened term for a picture element. It's basically 1 dot on the picture. You are probably viewing this presentation on a computer screen. Your computer screen likely has maybe 1,000 dots across and maybe 700, 800 dots up and down, giving you this giant grid of tiny, tiny little dots, each one of which is called a pixel. Each pixel has a specific color and a specific intensity, and we'll get into that in a moment. A megapixel is 1 million pixels. So if you can conceive of a square that's 1,000 pixels across and 1,000 pixels up and down, multiply those together, you've got a grid of 1 million pixels. That is a megapixel. And when we talk about cameras and photographs, we talk in terms of number of megapixels. The greater the number of megapixels, the greater the resolution of the image or the display. In order to demonstrate that, I want to show you a picture, and this goes back to our original camera basics talk, which you may want to look up. But speaking of pixels, this is a photograph, but if I display it at only 24 pixels, 4 pixels up and down and 6 pixels across, it basically looks just like a grid of various colored tiles. Doesn't look like a photograph at all. If I take it up to 8 by 12, still looks like a grid of squares. If I go to 16 by 24, the squares are getting smaller and different colors are coming out, but you still have no idea what the image is. If I go to 32 by 48, I'm up to 1500 pixels, but again, hard to know exactly what that is. If I go to 80 by 120, now you can recognize that at least I'm dealing here with a dragonfly on a piece of wood, but it still looks very blocky. Let's go up further. 160 by 240, I'm up to 38,000 pixels on this image, and it's looking more and more like a photograph, but still very, very sharp edges and lots of little teeny boxes if you look carefully. Now I'm at 400 by 600, it's definitely looking like a photograph now. I'm up to 240,000 pixels. Now let me take this up by another factor of 3 or 4. You'll notice that the wings and the dragonfly's face became a little sharper. I'm up to 960,000 pixels, and this is about the resolution of your computer screen, I suspect. So if I showed you a 6 megapixel image, it probably would not look any different on your screen than this image does. And that's because we've reached the resolution limit of your screen. So in order to demonstrate the benefit of even more pixels than what we're looking at here, which is close to 1 megapixel or a million pixels, let me just crop in on an area here and show you. Here's the close-up of that. When I started with an 800 by 1200 pixel image, or basically a 1 megapixel image, I get something that looks like this. Now it's not bad, but you see it's a little fuzzy. If instead I have an image that was cropped down from basically a 6 megapixel image, then you'll notice the difference here. The eyes, the nose, even the wood are sharper, have more detail in them, and thus the benefit of more pixels for image quality. Now we're pretty used to dealing with this, honestly. Here's a look at my computer screen on my computer at home. I can set my screen resolution to a variety of different settings. If you pull up your settings on your display properties, here's a screen at 800 by 600 pixels, or 480,000 pixels, so a half a megapixel. The resolution that I typically like to use is this one, 1280 by 1024, a little over 1 megapixel. I put one of my butterfly images as my background here. And this is a comfortable setting for me using a 21-inch monitor. I can go to higher resolution, however. This is 1600 by 1200, or I'm almost up to 2 megapixels here with this image, but then the icons become fairly small and hard on my aging eyes, so I typically prefer the middle one. So my usual monitor resolutions for my laptop, I typically run 1280 by 768, or just under 1 megapixel. For my desktop, just a little over 1 megapixel, and that's pretty standard for a computer screen. Basically, think of it as a 1 megapixel image. Now, how does this relate to cameras? Well, in the back of your camera is an image sensor. The image sensor can be a charge-coupled device or a complementary metal oxide semiconductor. The CMOS sensor is a little bit better, has a better signal-to-noise ratio, and is significantly better in low light situations. Most of the high-end digital SLR cameras now have a CMOS sensor. Now that sensor has on it individual photosites, or little light-sensitive cells, and they're arranged in a grid on that sensor, and they determine the number of megapixels in an image. If you have one photosite for each megapixel, then obviously the greater the number of photosites, the greater megapixel your images will be. The number of megapixels in an image is a very important determinant of its quality, as we've already shown here. Here are some of the cameras that I've either owned over the past 6 or 8 years or used. I started with an old Olympus stylus. It was about a 4 megapixel image, and I'll tell you what, it was fine for 4x6 prints. Not so great for enlargements. And it had a pixel count of 1704 up and down, 22 by 72 across. The first 3 on this list are compact cameras. The latter 3 are digital SLRs, bigger, bulkier cameras, but having better optics. My current camera is a Nikon D300, which is a 12 megapixel camera, 2848 by 4288 pixels. Now, the more megapixels is better, but it's not everything. The optics of a good digital SLR camera may really trump the greater megapixels of a point and shoot, in that you capture the image better with good lenses and a good camera body. So megapixels are good, but they're not everything. Let's move on now to color depth. What do I mean by color depth? Well, that refers to the number of bits. Remember, a bit is a switch. The number of bits used to represent the color of a single pixel in an image. This is also known as bit depth, or bits per pixel. And how many bits gives you how many numbers? Well, again, our familiar formula, 2 raised to the power of the number of switches or bits that you have, gives you your possible color combinations. So for example, if I use 4-bit color depth, that would give me 2 to the 4th, or 16 colors. Now that might be fine for a logo. For example, the logo of Fairview Hospital basically has white, black, 1 shade of green, and 1 shade of blue. So really 4 colors is adequate for that image. But how about for a photograph if you only had 16 colors? Well, here's a picture I took of my 3 kids last Christmas. You'll notice that 16 colors is totally inadequate for a good photograph. If you look carefully on this image, you'll see most of those 16 colors. You see in the teeth some white, in the faces 2 shades of gray. You see black on my son's hair. In the background you see red and yellow. On my son's shirt you see 2 shades of green. On my older daughter's top you see 2 shades of purple. So that takes us to 10 colors right there. So if we max out at 16 colors, it really looks more like a cartoon character, but doesn't look at all like a photograph. So we need more than 4 bits. How about if we went to 8 bits? Well, that would give us 256 colors. And, you know, that would be fine for something like these football logos of the AFC North, where my beloved Cleveland Browns are usually bringing up the cellar. How about for a photograph? Well, let's look at the same photograph in 256 colors. Well, it's certainly better than a 16 colors, but doesn't look great, especially on their faces, where it looks like they've got facial cream on from Mary Kay Cosmetics or something. Looking more like a photo, but still not very good. So we need more than 8 bits to code for the color on a photograph. And what has evolved as a standard is now 24-bit color depth, giving you 2 to the 24th power over 16 million different colors. So that same image in 24-bit color depth now looks like a real photograph. And this is called true color, 24-bit depth. Gives you over 16 million distinct hues. And they say the human eye might be able to go out as high as 10 million hues, but not beyond that. So these are very subtle distinctions between different colors, and this is, again, called true color. The way this works is you have 8 bits coding for red, 8 bits coding for green, and 8 bits coding for blue. In the decimal system, we go from 0 up to 255. If we're in hexadecimal, that's 00 up to FF, of course. And this is called the RGB system. Perhaps you've got a TV that's got RGB. It means for each pixel on your TV screen, there is a value for red, there's a value for green, a value for blue. And those 3 lights come together on that pixel spot to give you a specific color at that specific location. So 8 bits for red, 8 bits for green, 8 bits for blue adds up to 24 bits. Now, if you would conceive of all 3 of these having a value of 0, you would get black. But how would you get gray or white? Well, it turns out if red and green and blue are all equal, as you go from 0 to 255, if all three of those are 255, they're maxed out, you blend them together, you get bright white. And we're used to dealing with this if you think about it. My daughter, who's 12 years old, frequently likes to write papers for school and change the font color. Thinks that it's cool. So she'll click on this and it'll pull up some colors. Say, well, what if I don't like any of those colors? Well, then you click on more colors and you get a bigger grid, going from maybe 70 or 80 colors up to 150 here. So you have a lot of choices here to pick from. Here I've chosen kind of a bluish green. But what if you don't like any of those? Well, then you can click on Custom, and it'll bring up a grid something like this, where you've got this big flat grid, and then on the right-hand side, you've got a depth. So any specific color, the vertical bar to the right of that grid shows you the depth on that, going from kind of black at the bottom, white at the top, and different intensities as you slide up that panel. If you look at the bottom here, you'll see different numbers, one for red, one for green, one for blue. Using this coding system, you actually have 16+ million combinations of red, green, and blue. Thereby you get your true color. So let's do the math here. If you had a 12 megapixel image, that would be a fairly standard camera sensor size in 2011. How many bytes of computer memory will be necessary to store all the information from every pixel of that image? Here we're tying together our knowledge of bits and bytes to our knowledge of pixels and megapixels. So if my image is 3000 by 4000, or 12 megapixels, and each pixel takes 8 bits for blue, 8 bits for green, 8 bits for red, in other words 24 bits or 3 bytes, well, 12 million pixels times 3 colors times 1 byte per color gets us up to 36 million bytes for the image. And that would be a typical, what's called a BMP, bitmap, or a TIF, tagged image format file. But they're huge. They're giant files and difficult to work with. Thus, we have a need for compression. So let's speak next about file types and compression. What is file compression? Well, it's a way to take that big 36 million byte image down to a much smaller size. Now you can compress in two different ways. One is called lossless and the other is called lossy. Lossless compression maintains full information for every pixel. Let me give you an example of that. Here's a section of 10 pixels in a row that all have the exact same color. And you'll get this a lot with photographs, where you've got a portion of the sky that's all the same shade of blue. So you've got a bunch of pixels in a row that all have the exact same color value. In this case, it's kind of an orange, which has the color value red 248, green 109, and blue 66. Well, how would I code for that? Well, in the standard uncompressed format, for pixel number 1, I've got 3 bytes for the color. Pixel number 2, 3 bytes for the color. Pixel number 3, 3 bytes for the color, and so on. So 10 pixels with 3 bytes for each would get me to 30 bytes. However, it would be just as straightforward to say, you know, I've got a specific color, 3 bytes there, and I got 10 in a row of these. Well, the number 10 can be coded for by a single byte. So all of a sudden we've taken 30 bytes down to 4 bytes and we haven't lost anything. This would be akin to if I gave you $100 in $1 bills. What would you do with that? Well, it'd be hard to squeeze into your wallet. That's pretty thick. So you might go to the local bank and say, hey, I'd like my $100 in different notations. So you might get 5 20s. A lot easier to slip into your wallet. And guess what? You haven't lost a thing. You've still got $100 worth of value. You've just compressed it down to 5 20s instead of 100 ones. Same idea here. Now, lossy compression does eliminate some information from your file. It's usually fairly unimportant. If you had a very minor color variation in one of these 10 pixels, you know, red was 247 instead of 248. Well, technically it's different, but as far as the eye could tell, it's effectively the same. So it might round that up to 248 and then compress as I've shown above. So with lossy compression, you do lose a little bit of information in exchange for shrinking your file size down considerably. And that's what a JPEG file is. Let's go through the alphabet soup of image file types. BMP is a Windows bitmap. A TIFF is a tagged image file format. And both of these tend to be very large files and uncompressed, and we'll get into that momentarily. A JPEG, that terminology came from a group called the Joint Photographic Experts Group. There are RAW image files, and that's kind of a generic term for a family of image formats that may be proprietary. For Nikon, if I shoot RAW, it's saved as my image file name .NEF, standing for Nikon Electronic Format. With Canon, I believe it's CRW or CR2, and you may need proprietary software to decode that and turn it into a JPEG. DNG may be an up-and-coming format, basically a digital negative, the equivalent of a raw image, but not proprietary. A GIF, GIF, Graphics Interchange Format, is a format that is used mainly for little icons, logos, those football helmets that I showed you. They were all GIF files. And PNG files are now supplanting GIF files as the predominant form on the internet. Stands for Portable Network Graphics. Not quite as limited as GIF files. Let's focus on these three since we're talking about photography: TIFF files, JPEGs, and RAW. Let me go through those individually here. You'll notice that I have a period before them. That's because your image file has a specific naming format. And let's go through that quickly. You'll have a file name, a dot, and then a file type extension. For example, here's Willie, our hospital photographer. Here's a picture of him from 2009, November 17th, and I do like to denote photographs by date with that format. The reason is that if you put the year first and the month and the day, you'll store them sequentially rather than have all the Januaries together, all the Februaries together, and so forth. So especially if you put that at the beginning of your file name, it's not a bad way to go. I call this Willie H-2009-1117, and then you'll see the .jpg. That denotes that this is a JPEG file format. Your actual file name can contain lots of different characters. You'll see a dash in the one above. You can use underscore. You can use spaces. Anymore, you cannot use these characters, however, which have special meaning for computer purposes. And that file type extension, in this case .jpg, determines which Windows program loads the image for display. On your computer, you've got something called file type associations. For example, here's under folder options, you'll see file types. I've got highlighted JPEG, and whenever a JPEG image is double-clicked on, what my computer does is it opens that file with this, Windows Picture and Fax Viewer. Doesn't have to be that program. It can be Paint, it can be Adobe Photoshop, it can be Picasa. You can choose what program you want to open your image file. I like the Windows Picture and Fax Viewer because it loads very quickly. Some of the other ones take 10 or 15 seconds to load. And if I'm just interested in seeing the photo, I like this one. But that's what happens. You double click on that JPEG image, your computer knows to pull up this program to display it. There's also a free Windows program if you're working on a PC rather than a Mac. It's called Paint, and it's included for free with your Windows. And you get to it by going down the bottom left and pressing Start, Programs, under Accessories, and this program is called Paint. If you bring it up, it looks something like this. I loaded in this little picture of Wayne Szalinski that I showed you early on in this talk. Now this is a tiny little image, 137 by 159 pixels. It shows the image in exactly that pixel proportion on the computer screen. And then you'll notice if I save this, I can save it as a variety of different outputs. Save it as a JPEG again, or as a bitmap, as a GIF, TIFF. So this tiny little free program lets you switch from one format to another. If you're used to working with JPEGs, for example, and someone sends you a BMP file, just go to Paint, bring it as a BMP, save it as a JPEG, and then you're golden. Now there is a problem with Paint because it displays things at the actual image pixel density. Remember that picture of my 3 children that I showed you in different color bit depths? Well, if I bring it up in Paint, all I get is a tiny portion of the photo. And why is that? Well, my screen resolution is effectively 1000 by 1000, but this image is much bigger than that. 4183 across, 2787 up and down. So I'm only seeing maybe 10% of the image, the very top left portion of it. And occasionally you may run across something like this. If a person emails you a large image, 5 or 10 megapixels, but it's embedded right in the email and you try to read it, you'll see something like this and you have to move around on the screen to actually see the photograph. That's because it's being displayed at the actual number of pixels that the image has. Not a good idea to send images this large to other people or to upload to the internet. Alright, let's go through each of the image formats quickly. A TIFF file is generally uncompressed, although there is a way to compress it, but they tend to be very large. This would be that 36 megabyte image. It's not a good choice for shooting photos. Will chew up your memory card in a hurry, so I do not recommend that. However, it's a good choice for editing photos. If you're playing around with an image and you want to do a number of modifications to it, you may want to bring it in as a JPEG, convert it to a TIFF, and then edit it, save it as a TIFF, and you don't lose anything if you do lossless compression or no compression when you save it. So it's good if you're doing multiple edits. It's excellent for printing. Our hospital photographer, Willie, finds that sending images to a printer in TIFF format, while the files are large, gives you the very best quality images, even better than a large JPEG. It's also reasonable for archiving your photographs to a CD-ROM or to a DVD. It's very similar to the Windows proprietary, well, Bitmap BMP. Totally unacceptable for posting on the internet or for emailing someone. The images are too big, the file sizes are too large. Okay, how about JPEG? Well, this is certainly the most common digital photo format. It's universally readable by almost any program you have. If you've got a cell phone, it will shoot in JPEG. Most digital cameras will default to JPEG. Some you don't have any option. That's the only format in which you can shoot. There are variable degrees of lossy compression allowed. And again, this compression, you do lose a little quality, but typically it's not a lot. You can shrink the file down tremendously, often by a factor of 10 up to 50 times smaller, and still maintain fairly good quality with your image. It's certainly the best format for website posting or for emailing an image to someone. A word of caution with this, though, if you're going to edit it multiple times, every time you bring in a JPEG image, it starts compressed, you bring it into your editor, it decompresses it, and then you see the full image. You make your corrections, you resave it, it recompresses it. And if you do that multiple times, the image is prone to what's called generational degradation. It's effectively like taking any piece of paper you have, you make a photocopy of it, then you make a photocopy of the photocopy, then you make a photocopy of the photocopy of the photocopy, and so forth, and eventually your image gets pretty poor. Same sort of thing with JPEGs. If you save them repeatedly, edit, save, you lose image quality. So it's not a good idea to do that. If you're going to work in JPEG, try to make all your edits at the same time and save it out once and keep a copy of the original. There's another format, JPEG 2000, which really hasn't caught on except in the movie industry. RAW format files. This is what the purists use. Many professional photographers shoot RAW. This best represents what the camera truly sees. In fact, all digital cameras technically shoot in RAW and then convert internally to some other format. The file sizes are large, but not as large as the TIFF files, and that's due to a process called interpolation. And just a brief explanation of that for you technophiles out there. The actual image sensor, I said, has all these different photosites. Now the photosite, each one itself, really just reads an intensity of light, doesn't read color. So how do we get it to read color? Well, you put a little teeny filter over each site. For example, on the top of this little mosaic called a Bayer filter, after the guy that invented this process, you'll see a little green square. That's a green filter. And what this does, green light will pass through there, but red and blue light get absorbed by that filter. So the only thing that makes it down to the actual photosite happens to be green light, and so a certain intensity of green is coded for by that specific photo site, which goes to a pixel. Similarly, we've got red and blue ones on here, and it turns out that each individual sensor cell just receives one color then. That's the way a raw image is shot. Well, how do I get for that very top pixel that's only green, how do I get red and blue numbers for that one? Well, you bring them in from the adjacent sensor cells in what's called a demosaic process. That's how you end up getting 8 bits of color information for green, 8 bits for blue, 8 bits for red for any individual pixel. It's actually called interpolation. When you shoot RAW, you tend to have proprietary software, although higher level editing programs such as Adobe Photoshop, CS4, CS5, they'll typically read in RAW image formats from Canon, Nikon, and other major manufacturers. A big advantage of shooting RAW is that you can apply features, especially white balance, after the fact. When you're dealing with a RAW image, you're basically dealing with what the camera saw. And then if there's a specific hue to the light, you can adjust it with white balance after the fact. That's a big, big advantage of shooting RAW. You can also apply sharpening and other edits after the fact, rather than commit to them as you take the shot. It is thought that this format, the DNG, digital negative, may eventually supplant proprietary RAW images, but that remains to be seen. Just a few comments on GIF. This is used for logos and characters like those football helmets that I showed you. It's limited to 256 colors. Generally not acceptable for photographs, as we saw earlier. It's rapidly being supplanted by the PNG format, which is not confined to 256 colors. I already showed you some of these. That Geek Squad is a GIF. That Bayer filter is a PNG file. So to review, here are the 3 main formats we use for photographs. TIFF files are uncompressed, they're very stable, have great color depth, good for printing and good for archiving, but the drawbacks, huge file size and totally unusable for posting anything to the web. And in fact, not all programs can read TIFFs either. So it might be good to work in, but you may want to save your image out at the end as a JPEG. RAW image format gives you a true digital negative. The files are actually smaller than TIFFs. Great for post-processing capabilities like adding that white balance later, and also good for archiving. The downsides of RAW: proprietary, can be cumbersome to work with, have a large file size, and when you shoot RAW, especially shooting sports, it may limit the number of frames per second, particularly if you go to something called 14-bit RAW image acquisition as opposed to 12-bit RAW image acquisition. It slows it down quite a bit, maybe from 7 or 8 frames per second on my camera down to 2 or 3 frames per second. So RAW is not so good for shooting sports. JPEG format has a small file size, is universally readable, it's easy to upload and download, and it's perfect for the web and for emails. There are some downsides. It's not great for archiving. And there is lossy compression, which if you edit and save over and over again, you get that degradation of the image that we mentioned. Here's a photograph of 2 of the nurses with whom I work. They were at a wedding. I took this image. If I look at it in TIFF format, 35,814 kilobytes, or effectively 35 megabytes. Huge, huge image. In the RAW format for Nikon, the .NEF, 14 or so megabytes. Better, but still pretty large. I can shrink it down to a JPEG. I'm down to basically 1 megabyte image, and that's perfectly adequate, and you would be hard-pressed to tell any difference between any of these formats. All right, finally, how does this tie in with our workflow? Well, we're dealing with memory cards that acquire images, and one thing I would like to stress is before you use a card, after you've gotten everything off it onto your computer, you really should format it. Don't just delete the images. Format your memory card. If you delete the images, they're still technically on your card, but they've got in the table of contents that image has just been erased. But simply deleting the images leaves you much more prone to damaging a card so that it's not usable. You could just crash it. So all cameras have this option. You put the card in, you click on Format off a sub-menu. it says, hey, everything's going to be deleted. Are you sure you want to do this? So make sure you've uploaded everything from that card onto your computer. If you have, then you can go ahead, switch over to yes. Memory card is getting formatted and the format is complete. That totally cleans out the card and gives you a fresh table of contents so that you don't have extraneous data on there that can crash the card and corrupt it. Next, I like to choose my image format and the actual size. Typically I shoot in JPEG Fine, which means that it's less compressed and the best image quality in the JPEGs here. I always like to shoot at the largest size that your camera will offer. You can always compress down later, but you can never gain size if you shoot in medium or small. The only possible applications for that would be if you know that your only use of this photo is to post to the web, or I guess if your memory card is just about out of image space, you might want to shrink down. But otherwise, it's foolish to shoot in anything other than the largest size that your sensor will go. I set up my JPEG compression for optimal quality rather than smallest size. That way I get my very best quality image in JPEG. I do have these other options though. You'll see I could shoot in TIFF, or I can even shoot in RAW, or a combination of RAW and JPEG. And sometimes it's handy to do that. Say if you're doing an important photo shoot, you might want to shoot RAW and JPEG at the same time. You'll take, say, 100 photos. You'll look through them. You scan them through as JPEGs. You delete the ones you don't want. You may be down to 10 or 20 photos at the end. You delete the RAW files that go with the deleted JPEG files. And then for the important images, then you can go to work with the RAW images and do fine touching on them if it's an important shoot like a wedding, or you're meeting the president or whatever. So different ways people choose to work. A lot of professionals will shoot in RAW plus JPEG. Depending on what format you are shooting in, you have to assure that your memory card has enough capacity to get the amount of exposures that you'd like. I have an 8 GB memory card in my camera. If I shoot JPEG Fine, that gives me up to 732 images that can be stored, and that's more than any photo shoot I've ever done, so that's pretty good. If I shot RAW instead, I'm down to 390 images, still not bad though. If I shot TIFF, I'm even smaller, 209 images. If I shoot RAW plus JPEG, 254 images, and that would be fine for, again, most formal occasions, awards, banquets, whatever. In terms of special considerations for shooting, just remember to carry extra batteries, extra memory cards in case you fill up a card or you crash a card. It's a good idea not to delete the images from the card as you go. Your camera will allow that, but again, the image is still on the card, and then the next image that you lay down writes over it, and this can lead to card corruption. So if you've ever crashed a card, you'll understand that it's a pain in the rear end. There are some utilities that can get you back some of your information, but it's not easy. So try not to corrupt your cards. Don't delete images as you go. Just upload them all to the computer and then delete to your heart's content once they're there, and then reformat your card. Another good idea is to avoid filling up your memory card completely. That very last image could conceivably crash it when there's not enough space for the final image. As far as processing your image, well, I like to take the memory card out and use a card reader to transfer the images to your computer. Here are a few examples of card readers. This keeps you from connecting your camera directly to your computer with wiring, in which case a power surge could damage your camera. Not something you want. And it's nice to have a card reader around. You can pop a new memory card in your camera and go shoot away while you're uploading to your computer at the same time. I consider it a bad idea to take your card directly to the drugstore to edit and develop your prints, although I see people doing it all the time. But any edits you make are lost unless you want to purchase a separate disc that they'll give you the option of doing, but that's just a waste of money in my opinion. I like to put my images on my computer, edit them there so that I have a copy of the edited images. And I like to store the original images in a safe place on my hard drive. I back these up to an external hard drive and even keep them off-site so that in case of fire or whatever, I still wouldn't lose all my images. And then it's a good idea to always work with a copy of your original image rather than the shot coming right out of the camera. Take the ones out of the camera, put them in a separate directory, copy them over, and a lot of programs will do this for you automatically. A little freebie program from Google called Picasa is a wonderful program, which I detailed on the presentation called Digital Photography Workflow, and it keeps what are called Picasa originals for you and then lets you work on copies. So that's a good way to do it. Finally, when you save your files, you want to save them or export them, is often what a lot of imaging programs call. You export. You bring a file in, you work with it, and then you export it somewhere. And the size and the format you export it in depend on your application. If you're just beaming something up to Facebook or emailing an image to someone else, you may want to shrink it way down. Facebook will take whatever, you give it a 5-6 megapixel image, it shrinks it down to 100K. You might as well shrink it down yourself first. Same with an emailed image. I never like when someone sends me an email single photo that's 6 or 8 megapixels. Just takes a while to download. They should have shrunk it down to under a megapixel and I would get it much more quickly. Here is the Picasa program that I mentioned. You can take your image. This one we looked at earlier was basically 2000 by 3000 pixels, but I can use this Picasa and shrink it down here in this instance using the slider bar to 1200 pixels, and that's perfectly fine for something on the internet, perfectly fine for a presentation such as this where I'm using a computer screen, and it's perfectly fine even for 4x6 prints. That would be 1200 pixels across, so I've gone from 3000 down to 1200 without any noticeable loss of quality for those applications. In Photoshop, you get a different option if you're saving a JPEG. You have a sliding bar here that you can move to a small file or a large file, and over on the right it shows you how big the file is at that setting. Here it's a 1 megabyte file. I could go smaller by sliding to the left or retain more information by sliding to the right. If you're doing a 4x6 print, honestly 300 kilobytes is usually perfectly adequate. If you use Picasa and go to 1600 pixels across on a 4x6 image, that gives you 1066 pixels up and down. That's fine for a 4x6 image. If you're going to enlarge your photograph, however, you may not want to compress your image down at all. Ideally, you like to have about 200 pixels per inch of the final photograph. So if you're doing an 11 by 14 photograph that you're going to post on your wall, you'd ideally like to start with at least 2200 by 2800 pixels. That would be effectively a 6 megapixel image. I like to save my images in logical subdirectories on my hard drive under My Documents, My Pictures, and then I might do a file called Digital Photos 2011 with a bunch of different folders within that one. I like to keep my images organized rather than in one giant folder. I like to rename my images. Having images called DSC1004 isn't very meaningful. So after I upload them into my computer with those default names, I change the names to whatever the event was, and I tag a date on it as well. Many of the programs allow you to tag your images by subject, tag images of one child with this color, another child with a different color, and so forth. If you're consistent with that, it can lead to good organization. If you switch to a totally different editing program, as I'm prone to do, though, you lose all that. So I don't do that tagging so much. And then as far as your final output goes, if I'm going to walk down to the local drugstore or Walmart, I'd keep my images uncompressed. I'll beam them over to a CD or to my flash drive or to a different memory card, not the one in the camera, but a different SD card, for example. But I keep them there uncompressed in 5-6 megabyte file size. That's if I'm going to do it in person. If I'm going to upload them, though, to Walmart or CVS or Shutterfly or one of these internet services, then if I know I'm only doing 4x6s, I usually shrink them down to the 1600 pixels across, and that would typically be a file size of 300, 400, 500 kilobytes. A lot easier and quicker to upload that size. Same with Facebook. You want to compress those down. And then to summarize the workflow, basically, here's the approach that I think makes sense. You prepare to shoot, you format your card, you decide how you're going to set up your camera. You shoot your photos. They're sitting on your memory card. You take your memory card, put it in a card reader, transfer your photos to your computer. You want to save the originals off in a separate location. Then you take copies of those originals and you edit them to your heart's content and resave them. Again, never touching the originals. With your edited photos, you export them in the desired size and format depending on your application. If you want to make prints, you need a specific size. If you want to post on the web, not as stringent a requirement. Same with emails. And then finally, you want to periodically archive and back up your photos, typically on a second hard drive or an external hard drive or to a DVD periodically. Keep those in a different location so that you'll have some type of backup. So to summarize, we've talked about bits and bytes. That's the computer geek portion of this talk. We've talked about pixels and megapixels. Our cameras shoot in megapixels. We've talked about color depth, with true color being 24-bit, or requiring 3 bytes per pixel. 1 byte for red, 1 byte for green, 1 byte for blue. We've talked about file types and compression. We typically work with JPEGs, although other file types are possible. And if you're moving up with your camera skills, you might want to start experimenting with shooting in RAW format, which gives you the greatest flexibility with managing the images after the fact. And then finally, we've discussed workflow recommendations on keeping your card clean by formatting it and not simply deleting images, and then the whole workflow maintaining extra copies of your original photographs and not saving and resaving JPEGs too many times. Alright, well that's it for image file formats. I hope you've learned something in this talk. Thanks for watching.